What's up, E3? Here with Brian. We're going to talk airspace. There's a lot of airspace, there's a lot of rules out there. This doesn't replace any official guidance or legalese, but I think it's important to talk about some of the different airspaces out there, what's going on inside like a military operating area, a MOA. People just might see it on the chart and not really understand that there's things happening in there. They just might make some assumptions. So,
yeah. And I'm going to play the role of maybe a young or anxious pilot who don't got a lot of time, but we see all this stuff on the charts, and you know, we're not always sure because we're not flying a lot. But I want to take the role of like asking questions that I hear a lot, or asking even questions I think about, and let you tell me. But you tell me also from a standpoint of sometimes you're the F-16 pilot that's in those spaces, and then you see these people come in, or you have to come up on somebody in those spaces or intercept somebody. So I want to be able to ask you questions too on like, what's that experience for you? But I also wanted to be part of this because I have a lot of conversations with pilots, even just warning areas, alert areas, and we're going to go through all those. But it's sometimes it's interesting. I'll be flying with somebody and we'll be leaving here going north, and you know, they're going about 45 degrees in the opposite direction where we want to go. And I ask them, they're like, well, there's a warning area up there. I'm like, well, okay, well, first of all, you can fly through it. There's best practices, but why do you have to be 10 miles away? So I have questions like for you, like if you're in an MOA or something, I mean, are you guys like, if I fly right along the edge and just stay outside the MOA versus needing to be 10, 20 miles away? I mean, so I want to ask a lot of those kinds of questions for me. And I'll be kind of the amateur pilot, we'll say, just for this conversation. But let's start with the MOAs. Like that to me is a big question. First of all, I can fly into an MOA.
Right.
But what are, like, from your perspective, what are some of the best practices that I should think about before I go do that?
You know, so the best practice, that's a good thing to hit on, because there's a saying, what's legal and what's smart. So you're absolutely legal to go fly through an MOA, but it's important to know maybe what is happening inside that airspace, so that maybe you go fly through it, or maybe you reroute yourself and do something different. But one of my jobs I had prior to being a demo pilot was actually in charge of safety for the entire base. So I'd actually go out there and I would go to fly-ins. We would host fly-ins, bring in GA pilots to the Air Force Base, and just kind of talk in general what's going on around the airspace, around the base. Because one thing you do have to remember, that while you might not be located near an Air Force base or near a Navy base or an Army base for that matter, let's talk fast jets. They can cover a lot of ground pretty quickly. So while you might live in Georgia and there's no Air Force base around you, jets from South Carolina might be operating in that airspace. So it's important to be cognizant of that. While you might have an MOA near you, it might be being utilized by a base that's a couple hundred miles away potentially. So while you don't think it's very active around there, it actually might be more active. But so flying through an MOA, if you're on VFR flight following or an instrument flight plan, those are probably the first steps in kind of gaining some situational awareness as far as what's going on.
So you're suggesting at a minimum you should try to be on flight following, be talking to somebody before you fly through there?
You know, there's a lot of freedom flying VFR and not talking to anyone, and I can appreciate that. But if you're operating some of the airspace today, especially the Eastern Seaboard, for example, it is so congested and so busy. Being on flight following and occasionally getting a vector or an altitude change, while that might be a slight nuisance, that's either one, helping the bigger picture in the aviation community out, so hopefully you're trying to be a better person, but two, it's most likely going to keep you safe and away from a hazard. So let's talk about what's going on inside a military operating area, a MOA, and it can be a lot of different things. But typically, at like a fighter base that's utilizing a MOA, it can be upwards of 8, 10, 12, 16 jets operating inside that airspace. And while people make the assumption, because I got this a lot, well, you have a radar. What most people don't realize is, one, there are limitations to that radar, and that radar is being focused on fighting bad guys. People are acting as bad guys. It might be locked into fighter aircraft. It's not going to see you because it might be limited in the number of tracks it can acquire and manage. But also, most of the people who are flying through MOAs, they're flying so slow that the radars assume it's enemy chaff, and it filters it out, so it declutters the radar, and the pilot is not bothered with that. So I've had a couple close passes in my time, and it's all from pilots who are making the assumption that, oh, while I'm flying around airspace that has fighters in it, they can see me. Fighters don't have TCAS. It's one of those things. Now with ADS-B, it has been a big discussion in the Air Force and the Navy in particular, how to participate in ADS-B. It's passive for the most part, where a flight lead has a squawk in a formation of 4 or 6 jets. That squawk is taken to the ATC facility and then pumped into the system, so you get that. So while you might see 1 aircraft on your ADS-B, realize that there could be 3, 4, or 5 other of his friends that are rejoining. And they're not focused on what's really going on around. They're really focused on the aircraft ahead of them and facilitating the rejoin. And what's going on with that rejoin? That aircraft might be doing 450 knots. Realize that fighter aircraft have technical order waivers to operate faster than 250 knots below 10,000 feet. And again, when you're going at those speeds, you're focused
Closer
on
reach pretty quick.
right, and you're worried about being in formation. It might be an experienced guy, which doesn't really matter because again, they're kind of focused on the mission at hand, operating the aircraft. But it also might be a relatively inexperienced young wingman who we say is like riding the coattails or hanging onto the coattails, just trying to do their job as a wingman, which is essentially stay visual and stay in formation and don't hit their flight lead. Anything else, there's no room on that iceberg for any extra penguins. So a lot's going on in and around military bases, and it's not just right next to it. It might be hundreds of miles away. When you get inside that airspace, they're focused on training, they're focused on fighting and honing whatever mission set they're out there working on that day. And they're focused on the other fighter aircraft or the other military aircraft that are in the scenario that they're training with. Again, you might be filtered out.
Now, what altitudes are you usually at?
So it depends on the plane, right? But from 500 feet all the way up into the high 40s.
Okay, so the reason I asked that is because at our fly-in breakfast, I hear some guys say, oh, but I'm just flying low and slow at like 500 feet in my cub or something, and they're up there doing their thing, but that's not the case.
Yeah, so the story I tell, I started flying when I was in high school. I went on my solo cross country. So I was just outside of Atlanta, I was flying up to Augusta. So I fly up to Augusta, I land, I get my logbook signed. On the way back in, I drop at this airfield, get my logbook signed again, and then I bebop on the way back home. Fast forward like 16 years. I'm now out in the F-16 in the Bulldog MOA, which is out there in Georgia near Augusta, and I'm red air. I'm an adversary. I'm out there being a training aid for someone who's out there trying to hone their blue air tactics, the good guy tactics. And I'm down low. I find myself at 500 feet, 500 knots, going over this airfield. And I look down and I immediately recognize that that's the same airfield I stopped in and I dropped into as a 17-year-old getting my private pilot's license back in the day, which was an instant clue bird. There is a 17, 18-year-old, 19-year-old me, 45-year-old me that is bebopping around here completely clueless, that this airfield is here. And again, for me, moving at those speeds, at that time, I was focused on the fight. There are airfields in the airspace. You try to avoid those, but sometimes you just find yourself there. So getting down low is not something to avoid it. Realize that it might be an Air Force base that owns that MOA, but you never know. Let's say an Army unit is doing some work with ground guys and they have Apaches and things like that out flying around. They'll fly low. So by talking to ATC and seeing if the MOA is active, that's kind of the first clue bird.
So that basically what you do, just ask them straight
Ask
up.
ATC. If you're on an IFR flight plan, they're going to vector you around it. If you're VFR flight following, they're going to give you that clue bird. And if you're not talking to anyone, it definitely warrants talking to ATC. I have found that there are frequencies sometimes listed and associated with MOAs, but realize that fighters are going to be operating on UHF. Not many civilians are flying around with UHF capability. So while they might talk on VHF and not hear anyone respond, no fighter in that airspace is monitoring a VHF frequency. And if they are, they're definitely not monitoring that. They're monitoring a VHF interflight frequency and not that. So ATC, I think, is your fastest and safest way to figure out if that airspace is cold or if it's hot. And again, you can transit through it if it's hot.
I was going to ask you that. Because I've heard enough recordings where they confirm that it's hot and they still went through it.
I highly advise. It's, again, legal versus smart doing that. And let's say you do that. What's going to end up happening on the military side of the house is ATC hopefully will relay that, right? Hopefully. They should. Let's say if they have an emergency pop up in another sector, they get busy, things can happen. And also the airspace, the MOA boundary, if you're talking about hugging the boundary, like we take those boundaries very seriously. To the point if someone busts a MOA, they usually aren't flying. They usually have to sit a sortie. So it is very serious, but it does happen. So it's not a brick wall. So if you're hugging the border, just skirting, like, you still could get a face full of an F-16 that.
But when you're saying bust the MOA, are you talking about you guys might bust the
Yeah,
MOA?
absolutely.
So you might come out of it and
Yeah, spill out.
So that goes to the question of, can I feel safe that I can just skirt it and not have to be 20 miles away? But you said you still got to be pretty conscious of it.
I would still be aware of it, again, because it's not a steel wall right there. If you're, again, it'd have to be a pretty egregious spill out if it's spilling out more than, just a little bump. And again, I think, fighter pilots definitely, one, you want to do it right and be prideful, but again, things happen. So again, be cognizant of that. And again, if you're going to transit the MOA and ATC is going to relay that to the military, what's going to end up happening on the military side is they're going to knock off a fight. So again, you might have 2, 8, 12 jets out there. And what they're doing is they're out there utilizing a very limited resource, which is a jet and jet fuel. And they're doing training most likely for someone who's trying to upgrade to the next level, whether it be a flight lead or an instructor pilot. And these are limited rides. So they're kind of cherished.
Yeah.
When that fight gets knocked off, you're wasting a whole lot of gas, time, and resources. So for instance, we talked the F-16, it costs $8,000 an hour roughly to operate. A Raptor might be $35,000 an hour to operate. When you knock off one of those fights because you have to transit through that airspace, you're potentially costing your tax dollars upwards of $200,000, $300,000. Again, it factors into all the maintainers who are there on the ramp that launched all those aircraft, that now have to fix those aircraft and turn them for the next time. The hours that went into planning, prepping, briefing, and now debriefing this knocked off fight. So you really do, while it might save you 5 minutes.
So it's not about just, you have the right to go through it, but just think about, hey, you're pissing off a lot of guys and a lot of resources. There's the other side of it too that maybe a lot of pilots don't think about it. They just think they have the right, but not really thinking about the other side of that. Now, do you guys get in trouble if you bust that?
Well, that's what I was saying. So you try to, it is a very big deal and it's taken very seriously, but it does happen. Guys going out the top of the airspace. There's some weird shelves in airspace, especially if you start looking out over the East Coast and the warning areas and they start combining with ATCAs and things like that, where it might be surface to 45,000 feet for 150 nautical miles, but you need to operate inside this one part that has a 10,000 to 22,000 foot shelf. So you might spill out of the confines horizontally, you might spill out of the confines vertically, and that all gets debriefed. And again, like I said, typically if that happens, that pilot is going to sit out a sortie, which is not something you want to do. Like it's a ding on the pride. You might have to talk to people like why you did it, or or how do you prevent it in the future. So that's why I just say is like, when people make the assumption that a fighter aircraft sees them on the radar, if you're making the assumption that it's a brick wall and nothing can come through, you're leading yourself with a false sense of comfort that, hey, I can be right on this line and nothing bad will happen to me. Like, again, weird stuff happens. I think we all can relate to that in the aviation world. So again, there's smart and there's legal.
Okay. So obviously then it's like getting on the radio with ATC, checking if it's cold. If it's cold, great. If it's hot and you still go in it, well, obviously you got some stuff to think about. But even if it's cold and you're still going to fly through that, anything else we need to think about? I mean, could it possibly be that we were told it's cold, but then all of a sudden it goes hot, or,
Like anything is possible, but now the technology is so much better than it once was. That airspace is scheduled, and we talk like the Bulldog MOA, for instance, that's over there in Georgia. Users for that might be out of South Georgia at Moody, some A-10s and HH-60s. It might be F-35s out of Beaufort. It might be F-16s out of Shaw in South Carolina. It might be F-15s out of North Carolina. There used to be F-18s in Atlanta coming out of there. So that airspace can have a lot of users. And all that to be said is air traffic control has a pretty good idea of when guys are coming out to that airspace because they have to activate it in their flight plan and they're going to be operating under an IFR flight plan. So in my experience, ATC usually has a pretty good idea like, hey, this is going to go active. And if it's going to take you 45 minutes to transit through the MOA, hopefully they will give you a heads up or try to work around you or an altitude block. I've had people where they're in the airspace when we show up and they're at 8,000 feet and we'll set, a 10,000 foot floor, give a 2,000 foot buffer or 5,000 foot buffer. Again, it just kind of depends on what it is that day. But we've had to cap fights vertically and horizontally inside the airspace because of that. And that limits the training that you're getting out of that limited resource.
Okay. All right. And you guys, have you ever had to intercept somebody in an MOA that Yahoo that's not even talking ATC, that's just barreling through your...
It does happen, and what usually ends up happening in that scenario is typically you just set a buffer away from them. But I have found myself, or other guys have found themselves, where someone spills into the airspace or transits through the airspace without talking to ATC, and now it's getting better with ADSB and the information that's required to be pumped out there. But it might be an unknown altitude target, so you do try to go out there and find that person and just hover and escort them out of the airspace, if you will. Once they're outside the confines, then all right, whatever, let's go back to what we're doing.
So there's a little downside to this conversation, and that is because now you're going to get people to hear this and say, oh, cool, then I'll just go through. Those guys are going to make adjustments and stuff.
Right.
First of all, it's the respecting you guys and what you're doing in there, but the safety issues and stuff. But so MOAs, that's...
I mean, for what it's worth, me flying GA, obviously I come from that world and I have a lot of respect for it. If the MOA is hot, I'm not going to go fly through it or try to transit just to save me 10 minutes or 10 gallons of gas or whatever it might be. Because again, you try to be a good steward of resources. And I understand that I would be burning more gas if I'm having to go the long way or it's costing more time. So one, bad on you for not planning is what I would say to myself there. But two, you really are, you're wasting a lot of resources and you're wasting the time of a lot of people. And in my view, that's pretty selfish.
A little disrespect going on there at the same time.
Yeah, for sure, in my opinion.
That's how I look at it. All right, so let's, anything else about MOAs we should talk? Obviously, we're not training people here.
Right.
We're just trading our experiences. My conversation in the breakfast fly-in and you coming up on top of people and intercept them in an F-16. But, all right, so let's talk about alert areas.
So you're going to start finding, I think it probably ties into like alert and warning areas, finding off the coast more or less, which, we own only so much coastline and water routes, and then it becomes international waters. But you'll find alert areas and warning areas typically out over the water where you're operating. In my mind, it's equivalent to an MOA. It's being utilized by the military for training purposes. Can you fly through it? Again, absolutely. Should you fly through it? It depends.
Are there any other alert areas than military
I'm
using
trying to think,
or?
do you think, I'm trying to think of any alert areas that are popping in my mind outside of that anyone else would use.
I'm sure some folks will.
Undoubtedly.
It's more about procedures I want to talk about and learn from.
Yeah, undoubtedly. Again, there's always exceptions to this, and there's probably it's sitting over Kansas somewhere, but the users for that, again, are going to be the military, and I equate those to being like MOAs.
Why don't they call them a MOA?
Well, being out over, like for a warning area in particular, everything designated out over international water is a warning area. Why they do that, I don't know. There's probably some weird blip in the rules there, but the operations that are going on copy paste from an MOA that's operating over the land.
Okay.
So again, you can fly through it. You can transit through it, but finding out if that's hot or cold is warranted for sure.
Are there any times that an MOA or an alert or something where it's like I'm not talking about a TFR, but is there any times where it's like mandatory? We're saying you cannot fly into here right now.
There's some funny
Would they turn it into a TFR?
They would. So I don't know if they can legally ever tell you. Now, if you're on IFR clearance, sure, right? Like they're going to vector around. You got to listen to what they're doing, especially above 18,000 feet. Can't cancel IFR and just go trundling through there. But legally, I don't think there's anything they can do to prevent you from flying into there. They can highly advise against doing that. And I think there's some funny, I say funny, listening to it from a distance with people talking about their rights to fly into it, and then air traffic control highly advising and discouraging it based on the operations that are going on inside that.
Kind of a joke that we've had getting our captain's license, boating captain's license. I look at it the same way. It's like, yeah, you have the right up to the point of flying through somebody else's aircraft.
Yeah.
So it's like, be thinking about that. So.
Well, it's also, to me, this is a very basic, there should be a little self-preservation light that kicks on at some point. And again, when you're going in there, you're buying unnecessary risk, in my opinion, because you now are injecting a lot of unknowns. You're stopping this fight, but you've now mixed yourself amongst this dynamic environment that's going on.
So, MOA, restricted, alert. I mean, obviously, like prohibited. Like, what are the airspaces like? You just cannot fly into. I mean, obviously, you got nonstop the White House and all that, but TFRs is one issue. But then there's like prohibited.
Which prohibited, you're going to find that around DC, White House, and prohibited is prohibited. You are not going to go inside that airspace, or if you do go inside that airspace, it's probably not going to end well for you. There's some things that are going to happen before you get to that point, especially you're flying around the DC area in particular, because again, those are the ones that really popped to my mind as far as not being able to go in. You'll see restricted areas all over the country, and while those again are typically utilized by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, the rules vary with those. If they're cold or inactive, air traffic control, if it's been released to them from the owning agency, can permit people to fly through it, depending again what the restrictions are imposed on the airspace. There's some airspace, for instance, owned by the Department of Energy that doesn't matter who you are, you're only going so low or you're not going through it at all, and it might never get released to an ATC agency. So essentially, it becomes a prohibited area despite the fact of the name.
There's no reason for me to call and see, is this active and can I fly through it? Because it pretty much doesn't happen, right?
Yeah, there's some, like for instance, there is one that's right outside Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, R6002. We call it a postage stamp for an F-16 to fly in it because it's only about 7 miles by 12 miles wide, but it's a bombing range. So it's inert bombs that get dropped on it, so concrete bombs, but then live 30 millimeter shot, 20 millimeter shot, depending on what platform's in there. But you can fly through that, and it's right there, and there's a couple different little regional airports that are in and around there, and ATC will tell you if R6002 is cold or if it's hot. They'll vector you around if need be, but you need
and
to
that's a prohibited?
That's a restricted area, so you need to be talking to someone there, and you can't be just VFR, I'm going to go through this airspace. Again, it might not end well for you.
So what's the difference in restricted versus prohibited?
Really, prohibited you're not going into. It is prohibited. It's like, I just want to go check out and fly over the White House. Like,
let's see what happens.
Yeah.
See how that works out.
You can do anything once, right? Anything once.
All right, so tell me your experiences with, you got to intercept any aircraft that did that?
So we're talking a lot of stuff is, my experience has been in MOAs with people either transiting through unannounced or announced, talking to ATC, and you have to stop the fight. The unannounced ones, the fight gets knocked off. Guys are usually holding high to save gas. A couple instances where we'll lock them up on the radar in the targeting pod and identify them just for curiosity's sake, and then follow them out of the airspace just so we can knock the fight back on. But one thing that we did an episode with Boat up at Oshkosh was talking about being intercepted. And there are guard and reserve units. And
so can we talk about this?
Yeah.
Because we got to tell people, make sure you go check this out. So we did a really cool episode, and we'll have John talk about it. But like, if you're intercepted, for whatever reason, whether you're in prohibited or whatever, for some reason you get intercepted, all the procedures and what to do. And in your membership, we actually have the cards from, what's his agency?
So NORAD, the North American.
So we have the cards in there for members, and we kind of go through this really great interview that John did. But yeah, so keep going. Sorry to interrupt you, but I want to make sure people check that out.
Well, no, it's important, I think, for people to check that out. That information, I think it was a really good conversation we had with Boat, because he's a former F-16 pilot. Now his job is managing the program to, one, if you're a civilian pilot and you get intercepted, what do you do? That public education piece is huge. But again, there are guard and reserve units all across the country that have an alert mission. So they're sitting ready to launch at a moment's notice, and they can get airborne fairly quickly, and they're going to go out there and intercept that plane. Boat and I talk about in that episode what to do if you're intercepted. Again, the time to figure out what to do if you're intercepted is not when you're being intercepted. Hopefully you can avoid it by mission planning and not get to that point, but if you do, it's nice to have a little bit of knowledge to like, okay, I messed up, this is what's happening, this is what I need to do. So we go through that in great detail. But again, guard and reserve units are across the country there that if people violate prohibited airspace, restricted airspace, if they're not talking to air traffic control when they should be, like up in Class A airspace, violating a TFR, or approaching, it looks like they're going to violate a TFR, such as a presidential TFR, which is quite large, you're going to have fighter aircraft that are showing up, one on your wing, and his buddy is probably hanging back at a few miles just to do any work that might be needed if you're not paying attention and doing what you need to be doing.
See, that's up there in the top 10 of what not to do as
Right.
as a pilot.
Not where you want to be in life. Not where you want to be in life. There are definitely some stories of people getting intercepted or trying to run from being intercepted. And actually down here in Florida, I think it's Spruce Creek, a big neighborhood.
Oh, yeah.
But, you know, guys have been intercepted, and there's a good story of a guy being intercepted and he ducks into one of those neighborhoods. But, you know, there are sensors on the jet, and in particular like IR signatures. You're able to detect where they are. And so my buddy actually had one of those scenarios, and with his targeting pod, by the time he got his targeting pod on him as this guy landed, you can see all the sheriff's deputies and the Secret Service showing up there. So yeah, you don't want to fly through a TFR either without permission.
So if we listed these as saying like the big no-nos are prohibited to warning to MOAs, restricted, alert. I mean, so those you can, but so it seems like what I'm hearing from you is, you know, just be conscious, situational awareness, communication. Like
100%.
You know, that's really, if you would just be those, you'd probably eliminate 90% of your issues.
You know, and as an Air Force pilot, there's an aversion to flying VFR. I did a lot of VFR flying because one, you're not allowed to do it unless it's you. There's no other means of executing the mission without doing VFR. But being a demo guy, going to these places, there are times that you would be VFR more so than most. But I'm still talking to ATC as the max extent possible, just to build my essay as far as what's going on and to get those last minute glove saves or the heads up so I don't go trundling down some kind of path I don't want to be on. But, you know, we just kind of hit on TFRs. You know, if you talk like prohibited area, like that's a stake in the ground, you know where it's at, like there shouldn't be any question. TFRs, having some awareness of where TFRs are, and they also can move and be mobile, like if the plane's moving that he's on, the president's on, that TFR is moving. So you have to be cognizant. That's where the mission planning definitely comes into
Well,
play.
and then there's so many TFRs come up now just for a baseball game.
Right.
There's a TFR. Matter of fact, we just flew the Cub down around Miami, and on a couple days a week, we would have been inside the TFR on our flight today.
From sporting events, air shows, parachute jumpers, wildfires that are going on. There's so many things that TFRs can pop up for, so it warrants having some route study.
Okay, so when it comes to prohibited TFRs, is there any different level of consequences if you fly into a prohibited versus a TFR? Or, I mean, obviously it's all just bad, shouldn't do it, but is it looked at differently between you guys and everybody?
You know, I think it depends. I'm not sure what the FAA, there's some things like the prohibited, if you fly into the White House airspace, like that's going to have some consequences there. But the nice thing I think we've seen the FAA do in recent years is the self-reporting. Like if you make a mistake, you can report that. And usually it's just
the NASA report.
Hey, no harm, no foul, essentially. Learn from your lesson, learn from your mistake and move on. But now with the technology there, talking to my friends that are air traffic controllers, if you just like clip a TFR and they don't say anything, or maybe they just give you a vector away kind of as a bro level like fix, those tapes get audited. So they're kind of handcuffed at some point where they have to report and make a phone call and talk about it.
So don't expect that you might get a little friendly.
Yeah, I think now it's tougher and tougher because everything is being recorded. You know, from ADSB to their tapes, and their tapes are getting audited. So getting away with it and like, hey, it wasn't a threat. It wasn't going to harm anything. The TFR was cold. You know, there's no firefighting going on in that TFR at the time, so it wasn't a conflict. Now you like cross the line, everything is recorded. So if they don't say anything, then their job's on the line. So again, it goes back to that kind of route planning study and just trying to set yourself up for success and, you know, talk on the radio.
Yeah, and of course, I'm certainly not suggesting that people try to get away with something,
Right.
but, you know, accidents happen or whatever. But so, I mean, like you said, if you fly into a TFR and you came out and nobody said anything or whatever, I mean, should you just go file a NASA report? Or
I think, you know, essentially it's free, right?
Yeah.
You know, like, and it's, did you do that intentionally? Did you do it unintentionally? The questions I would ask. And if you realize that you made that mistake, and that's a pretty big mistake, file the report, right? That's a lesson learned that might also help someone else out. That's a data point there. You learn from it. As pilots, we want to learn from others, and it covers you, right? So
Yeah.
I would recommend it.
But so many people are so afraid to the FAA, and they're so afraid of filing reports, and they're so afraid of putting their name on something, you know? But I guess what's the alternative is well, do you want to do that and you're probably going to be okay
Right.
versus you could lose your license? You know, I mean, you got to kind of think about those things.
You know, the one thing in the fighter pilot community is big is, I mean, it's owning mistakes. Like, no one has a perfect sortie. Everyone makes mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes have bigger consequences than others. Playing I have a secret usually never works out well. So if you do something like that, owning it up and getting ahead of it usually is a little bit easier than not. And the NASA reporting system, again, I think, you know, never say never, right? But part of that is being able to share those lessons learned so that others can not make the same mistake, but not having retribution that comes from that. So,
Okay. So are like any stories or anything you can share with us on like people getting intercepted from your world or?
you know, so I never had to intercept anyone in an alert capacity. A lot of buddies who did, like I said, the person who kind of ducked into the fly-in neighborhood, which I thought was kind of comical, especially the fact that they get rolled up pretty quick. But, you know, even as an F-16 pilot, like I have to adhere to those same type rules. So for instance, when President Trump was down in Mar-a-Lago all the time, I was flying a lot of air shows in Florida, Stewart Air Show in particular. Depending on when he was going to be there, like his TFR would pop up down that way. And I flew the Stewart Show multiple times. But the runway I was operating out of, about 500 feet of the runway, was inside the 30 nautical mile TFR. So for me to go out there and operate, fortunately I was an F-16 and I had the ability to use SATCOM and some other radios to talk to my buddies, literally from the same base that were flying combat air patrols, enforcing that TFR throughout the weekend because it's a 24/7 operation. To work my coordination to be able to take off and then enter the TFR and then quickly get outside the TFR. But, you know, I had to use that part of the runway to do it. So it's interesting that, yeah, everyone plays by those rules.
Interesting. Anything else we should talk about? I mean, I feel better now that I can actually help people ask me questions and a little more comfortable about dealing with these special use spaces. And
You know, I think, again, like the takeaway for me, and hopefully that people are getting, is the communications piece. You know, there, again, I hammer home, like, there is what's legal and then what's smart. Communicating, taking a vector around an airspace, not going through it, but just because legally you're allowed to, and doing something that might be a little bit more of an inconvenience is better for the greater good and safer for you, ultimately. And that's what you want to do. Like, whether it's flying point A to point B, you want to do it safely. If it's doing loops to music, you want to do that safely. So being cognizant of what's going on around and the bigger picture, I think, is important.
And I think nowadays with ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot and all the stuff we have, even right down to being able to get a frequency on your phone, not needing to find it on a chart, there's almost no excuse anymore to.
Yeah.
And that stuff is all made to help you stay alive and to be safer and make the system better. So it's just so simple nowadays to be able to use this stuff and do the right things. So.
100%. It's there, the technology exists, so embrace it. Let's be safer as we go out there and operate in the National Airspace System.
Awesome. I appreciate it, John. This was helpful for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
Take care, guys.
Cheers.